The security footage would later show exactly 3 seconds between the moment. Lieutenant Commander Hayes kicked Petty Officer First Class Rivera in the stomach, and the moment he realized he had just made the biggest mistake of his military career. 3 seconds that would end his command, destroy his reputation, and become legend throughout the Pacific Fleet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Naval Station Pearl Harbor's Advanced Combat Training Facility, casting long shadows across the pristine white buildings that house some of the Navy's most elite training programs. The air shimmered with heat and humidity, thick enough to taste the salt from the nearby harbor, mixed with the acrid smell of ordnance from the nearby firing ranges. Lieutenant Commander Jonathan Hayes stood at the center of the main training courtyard, his freshly pressed khaki uniform somehow managing to repel the oppressive Hawaiian heat that had everyone else's clothing clinging to their bodies like a second skin. At 38, Hayes was the kind of officer who had spent more time perfecting his appearance than his leadership skills. His uniform was regulation perfect, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every ribbon aligned with mathematical precision, his cover sitting at the exact angle prescribed by Navy regulations. Hayes had been assigned to oversee the Inter-Unit Combat Readiness Assessment, a quarterly evaluation where different Navy specialties demonstrated their capabilities to visiting Pentagon officials and allied observers. It was the kind of high-visibility assignment that could make or break a career, and Hayes knew it. He saw himself as the star of this show, the authoritative voice that would guide distinguished visitors through the impressive capabilities of modern naval warfare. The assembled crowd was impressive, a mix of seasoned chiefs, young sailors eager to prove themselves, visiting officers from allied nations, and a handful of Pentagon brass whose opinion could shape naval policy for years to come. Hayes felt the weight of their attention, and it fed his ego like oxygen feeds a flame. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard with practiced authority, "what you're about to witness today represents the pinnacle of naval combat training. These demonstrations will show you why the United States Navy remains the dominant maritime force on the planet." As he spoke, his eyes swept across the assembled personnel, cataloging faces, noting ranks, ensuring everyone understood who was in charge. His gaze lingered on a small group of sailors standing quietly near the back of the formation. Among them was a woman who immediately drew his attention, not because she stood out, but because she seemed determined not to. Petty Officer First Class Carmen Rivera was the kind of person who could disappear in a crowded room, despite being right in front of you. She was of medium height with a compact, athletic build that her loose-fitting utilities completely concealed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so perfectly unremarkable that it seemed designed by committee. Her face was pleasant, but forgettable high cheekbones that spoke of Latin heritage, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing, and skin weathered by sun and salt in a way that spoke of real time at sea rather than training exercises. What Hayes noticed most, however, was her posture. While the other sailors stood in various degrees of attention, shifting their weight, adjusting their covers, or whispering quietly to each other, Rivera stood with an absolute stillness that was almost unnatural. Her feet were positioned with mathematical precision, her weight perfectly balanced, her breathing so controlled that it was barely perceptible. It was the kind of stillness that spoke of thousands of hours of discipline, the kind that could only be earned through experiences Hayes couldn't imagine. But Hayes didn't see any of that. What he saw was an opportunity. "The modern battlefield," Hayes continued, beginning to pace in front of the formation with theatrical precision, "is no place for social experiments or political correctness. It is a place where physical superiority, mental toughness, and absolute dedication to excellence are the only currencies that matter." His words carried a weight of implication that wasn't lost on anyone present. Several of the senior enlisted personnel exchanged glances, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes revealing their discomfort with the direction of Hayes's remarks. "We cannot allow sentiment or misguided policies to compromise our operational effectiveness," Hayes went on, his voice growing more confident as he warmed to his theme. "When lives are on the line, when the mission hangs in the balance, there is no room for weakness, no place for those who cannot meet the absolute standards our service demands." As he spoke, Hayes began moving through the formation, ostensibly inspecting the personnel but actually seeking out Rivera. He had noticed her earlier during the morning briefing, quiet, unremarkable, seemingly disconnected from the energy and camaraderie of the other sailors around her. In Hayes's worldview, shaped by decades of peacetime service and a fundamental misunderstanding of what real combat experience looked like, her silence represented weakness rather than wisdom. Her calm demeanor suggested timidity rather than confidence. "Some of you," Hayes said, stopping directly in front of Rivera, "may be wondering if you truly belong in this elite environment. You may be questioning whether you have what it takes to stand alongside the warriors who have earned their place here through blood, sweat, and absolute commitment to excellence." Rivera's expression remained unchanged. Her dark eyes met Hayes's gaze with a steadiness that was somehow both respectful and completely unimpressed. She said nothing, did nothing, revealed nothing. Her silence was not the silence of intimidation or uncertainty. It was the silence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone, especially not to a peacetime officer whose biggest challenge had been navigating Pentagon politics. But Hayes interpreted her composure as confirmation of his assessment. In his mind, she was exactly what he expected: a diversity hire, a checkbox on some bureaucrat's form, a symbol of everything he believed was wrong with the modern military. He saw her presence as a dilution of standards, a concession to political pressure that endangered the very institutions he claimed to protect. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Hayes couldn't see, standing there in his immaculate uniform with his carefully groomed confidence, was that he was about to encounter something far beyond his understanding. He was about to learn that the quiet professional, the one who doesn't need to announce their capabilities or demand respect, is often the most dangerous person in any room. The morning was about to become a lesson in assumptions, respect, and the potentially catastrophic cost of underestimating someone whose silence speaks louder than any boast ever could. From her position in the back formation, Petty Officer First Class Carmen Rivera watched Lieutenant Commander Hayes with the detached analytical focus of someone who had learned to read people's intentions long before they acted on them. While the other sailors shifted uncomfortably under his increasingly pointed remarks, Rivera remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled, her dark eyes tracking Hayes's movements with the precision of a targeting system. To the casual observer, Rivera appeared to be everything Hayes suggested she was: unremarkable, quiet, perhaps even intimidated by the formal setting and distinguished visitors. Her utilities hung loose on her frame, concealing the lean muscle built through years of conditioning that had nothing to do with gymnasium workouts and everything to do with operational necessity. Her hands, when they moved, did so with an economy of motion that spoke of countless hours spent handling weapons, rappelling down cliff faces, and moving through hostile territory where a single unnecessary gesture could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But these details were invisible to Hayes, whose understanding of military excellence had been shaped by parade grounds and PowerPoint presentations rather than midnight raids and close-quarters combat. He saw her regulation haircut and assumed conformity. He saw her silence and assumed submission. He saw her unassuming presence and assumed weakness. What Hayes couldn't see was the small scar above Rivera's left eyebrow. Nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, a souvenir from a piece of flying concrete during a building breach in a city, whose name would never appear in any official after-action report. He couldn't see the way her eyes automatically cataloged exits, cover positions, and potential weapons in any environment she entered. A habit so ingrained it had become as unconscious as breathing. Most importantly, he couldn't see the coiled readiness that lived just beneath her calm exterior. The result of training so intensive and experiences so harrowing that they had fundamentally rewired her nervous system. Where other people experienced adrenaline as chaos, Rivera had learned to channel it into crystal clear focus. Where others saw threats, she saw problems with solutions. Where others felt fear, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility. Rivera's journey to this moment had begun years earlier in the unforgiving mountains of Colorado, where she had been one of only 3 women to complete a selection process designed to break the strongest men the military could produce. The instructors hadn't lowered the standards, they couldn't afford to. The missions that awaited successful candidates demanded a level of capability that admitted no compromise, no exceptions. No consideration for gender or background or anything else except the ruthless mathematics of life and death. She had earned her place not through politics or quotas, but through a demonstration of skills that left her instructors struggling to find adequate words for their evaluations. Her marksmanship scores weren't just excellent, they were unprecedented. Her performance in close-quarters combat scenarios wasn't just competent, it was artistry. Her psychological evaluations revealed a mind capable of maintaining absolute clarity under pressure that would render most people catatonic with terror. But perhaps most importantly, Rivera had learned value of invisibility. In a world where ego could get you killed, where the loudest voice in the room was often the first one silenced by enemy fire, she had discovered that true strength lay not in domination but in preparation, not in intimidation but in competence, not in demanding respect but in earning it through actions that spoke louder than any words. Standing in that courtyard under the harsh Hawaiian sun, Rivera represented everything the modern military aspired to be: a warrior scholar whose capabilities were matched only by their restraint, whose deadly skills were balanced by an unwavering moral compass, whose absolute confidence required no external validation. She was the product of a selection and training process so rigorous that fewer than 5% of those who attempted it ever reached completion. Yet none of this was visible to Hayes, whose worldview had been shaped by a military experience consisting primarily of staff assignments, PowerPoint briefings, and carefully choreographed exercises where the enemy was cooperative and the outcomes were predetermined. His understanding of combat came from movies and after-action reports rather than the chaos of actual firefights. His knowledge of real warriors came from their service records rather than shared experiences in places where courage was measured not in medals but in the simple fact of survival. As Hayes continued his inspection, moving through the formation with theatrical authority, Rivera noticed details that others missed. She saw the way he favored his left leg slightly, an old injury, probably from a training accident rather than combat. She noted the soft hands that had never gripped a rifle under fire, the pale skin that spoke of air-conditioned offices rather than desert deployments. Most tellingly, she observed the way his eyes constantly sought the approval of the visiting dignitaries, the way his performance was calibrated for the audience rather than focused on the mission. These observations came without judgment. Rivera had learned long ago that every person had their role to play, and peacetime military leadership required skills she had never needed to develop. But she also recognized something dangerous in Hayes's demeanor, a combination of insecurity and authority that created a volatile mixture. She had seen it before in junior officers who confused their rank with their competence, who mistook the deference of subordinates for genuine respect. Rivera's teammates The small group of quiet professionals who stood nearby recognized the signs as well. They had worked together in places where trust was earned through shared hardship and proven competence rather than granted through organizational charts. They communicated through glances and subtle gestures that conveyed more information than most people could express in paragraphs. They knew Rivera's capabilities because they had witnessed them firsthand in environments where there was no room for pretense or politics, but to Hayes and the majority of the assembled personnel. Rivera remained what she had always chosen to be: invisible, unremarkable, easily overlooked. It was a carefully cultivated persona that had served her well in a world where the most dangerous operators were often the ones no one saw coming. She had learned that true power lay not in being feared or respected, but in being underestimated by those who might wish her harm. As Hayes's inspection continued, and his remarks grew more pointed, Rivera maintained her position with the patience of someone who had spent countless hours motionless in observation posts, waiting for the perfect moment to act. She felt no need to defend herself against his implications or prove her worth to his satisfaction. Her value was not determined by his opinion, and her confidence did not require his validation. She simply waited, ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that when the moment arrived, if it arrived, her training, her experience, and her absolute commitment to excellence would speak for themselves in ways that words never could. Hayes's inspection had taken on the quality of a predatory hunt, and everyone present could feel the shift in atmosphere as his attention became increasingly focused on Rivera. What had begun as a routine demonstration for visiting dignitaries was evolving into something far more personal and uncomfortable. "Physical standards," Hayes announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard with renewed authority, "are not suggestions. They are absolute requirements that exist for one simple reason: they save lives." He paused dramatically, ensuring he had the full attention of both the assembled personnel and the Pentagon officials whose approval he desperately craved. When your teammate needs to be carried out of a kill zone, when equipment failure means someone has to bear extra weight for the entire unit, when the mission requires every ounce of strength and endurance you possess, that is when we discover who truly belongs among the elite. As he spoke, Hayes began moving deliberately through the formation, but his path was clearly predetermined. He was working his way systematically toward Rivera, building momentum for what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone present. The other sailors began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the direction this was heading and feeling powerless to intervene. The visiting officers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern as they witnessed what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated public demonstration with an unknown endpoint. "Some of you," Hayes continued, his voice taking on a more pointed edge, "may have heard about recent policy changes, about new initiatives designed to expand opportunities and increase representation." His words dripped with barely concealed disdain, and several of the senior enlisted personnel felt their jaws tighten with suppressed anger. They knew exactly what he was implying, and they knew exactly where this was leading. Hayes finally stopped directly in front of Rivera, close enough that his shadow fell across her face in the bright Hawaiian sun. "But policies change," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational level that somehow carried to every corner of the courtyard. "Regulations evolve. Political priorities shift. What never changes, what can never be compromised, are the fundamental requirements of combat effectiveness." Rivera remained motionless, her expression unchanged. Her dark eyes met Hayes's gaze with a steadiness that revealed nothing: no anger, no fear, no defensiveness. To the observers, it might have appeared that she was simply enduring his attention with professional courtesy. In reality, she was conducting her own assessment, reading his body language, noting his tells, calculating angles and distances with the unconscious precision of someone whose survival had once depended on such observations. "Petty Officer Rivera," Hayes said. her name rolling off his tongue with theatrical formality. "Step forward." The command hung in the air like a challenge. Rivera moved with fluid precision, taking 3 measured steps that brought her into the center of the formation, directly under the scrutiny of dozens of pairs of eyes. Her movement was economical, balanced, and somehow conveyed both respect for military protocol and complete self-assurance. "Tell me, petty officer," Hayes continued, beginning to circle her slowly like a shark sensing blood in the water. "What do you think these distinguished visitors should know about modern naval combat readiness?" The question was clearly designed to put her on the spot, to force her into a position where any answer would be inadequate, where her response could be used as evidence of whatever point he was determined to make. Rivera considered the question for a moment, her silence extending just long enough to make Hayes believe he had succeeded in intimidating her. When she spoke, her voice was clear and measured, carrying easily across the courtyard without any need for theatrical projection. "I think they should know that combat readiness isn't determined by assumptions, sir," she said simply. "It's demonstrated through performance under pressure." A ripple of barely suppressed surprise moved through the assembled personnel. Her answer was respectful but pointed, professional but quietly challenging. Hayes felt a flash of irritation that she had managed to turn his question back on him, that her response had somehow shifted the dynamic in a way he hadn't anticipated. "Performance," Hayes repeated, seizing on the word like a weapon. "Yes, let's talk about performance." He gestured broadly to the assembled crowd, ensuring everyone understood they were now part of his demonstration. "Performance in combat isn't about equal opportunity. It's about physics. It's about biology. It's about the brutal mathematics of survival." Hayes began to pace again, his movements becoming more animated as he warmed to his theme. When a wounded teammate needs to be extracted under fire, when equipment failure means redistributing 60 pounds of gear among the survivors, when the mission requires breaching a door that's been reinforced against exactly that possibility, those moments don't care about policy initiatives or diversity metrics. The crowd was growing increasingly uncomfortable. What had begun as a professional demonstration was clearly evolving into something more personal, more pointed. Several of the visiting officers were beginning to look confused and concerned, unsure of the purpose or appropriateness of what they were witnessing. "So let me ask you directly, Petty Officer Rivera," Hayes said, stopping once again in front of her, his voice now carrying a barely concealed hostility. "Do you honestly believe you can match the physical capabilities of your male counterparts? Do you really think you belong among operators whose capabilities have been proven under actual combat conditions?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. It wasn't really a question at all. It was a public challenge designed to humiliate, to force an admission of inadequacy, to provide ammunition for whatever argument Hayes was constructing about standards and capabilities and the supposed dangers of social engineering in military selection. Rivera looked at him for a long moment, her expression still revealing nothing. Around them, the courtyard had fallen into an uncomfortable silence as everyone present realized they were witnessing something that went far beyond a routine inspection or demonstration. They were watching a systematic attempt to publicly humiliate a subordinate, carried out under the guise of professional instruction. "I believe," Rivera said finally, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that somehow seemed to fill the entire space, "that capability is best demonstrated rather than debated." "Sir," her response was perfect in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Without directly challenging Hayes' authority or questioning his motives, she had essentially invited him to prove his point through action rather than rhetoric. She had called his bluff in front of the most senior military leadership present, and she had done it with such professional courtesy that he couldn't object without appearing petty and vindictive. Hayes felt a surge of anger and frustration. His carefully constructed demonstration was slipping away from him, And worse, he was beginning to sense that he was losing the crowd. The visiting officers were no longer nodding along with his pronouncements. They were watching Rivera with growing curiosity and respect. The assembled sailors were no longer laughing nervously at his implications. They were waiting to see how this would resolve. Most dangerously, Hayes was beginning to realize that Rivera wasn't reacting the way he had expected. Her calm confidence was unshakable. Her responses were too measured and intelligent, and her presence somehow commanded respect in a way that his rank and authority had failed to achieve. For the first time since beginning his demonstration, Hayes felt genuinely uncertain about his ability to control the situation. But rather than retreat, rather than recognize the warning signs and find a graceful way to conclude his inspection, Hayes made the fateful decision to escalate further. His ego, his insecurities, and his fundamental misunderstanding of what he was actually confronting combined to drive him toward a confrontation that would change everything. The morning sun continued to beat down on the courtyard, but the atmosphere had grown cold with tension and anticipation. Everyone present could sense that they were approaching a moment of truth, a convergence that would reveal something important about capability, respect, and the true nature of strength. Hayes's frustration had reached a boiling point, and his carefully constructed facade of professional authority was beginning to crack under the pressure of Rivera's unshakable composure. What should have been a simple demonstration of his point about physical standards had instead become a public test of wills that he was clearly losing. The visiting Pentagon officials were no longer nodding in agreement with his assertions. They were watching with growing skepticism as his behavior became increasingly erratic and personal. "Very well, petty officer," Hayes said, his voice taking on a harsh edge that made several of the assembled sailors exchange worried glances. "Since you seem so confident in your capabilities, let's move beyond theoretical discussions." He gestured toward a cleared area of the courtyard where training equipment had been arranged for the day's demonstrations. "Physical fitness standards exist for a reason, and I think our distinguished visitors deserve to see exactly what those standards look like in practice." Rivera nodded once, a slight inclination of her head that conveyed both acknowledgement and complete readiness. Her movement to the designated area was fluid and precise, covering the distance with a stride that spoke of countless hours of conditioning and training. The crowd followed, forming a loose circle around the demonstration space, their earlier casual interest now replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to thicken the already oppressive Hawaiian air. Hayes moved to equipment rack and selected a standard military rucksack, the kind used in endurance training and field exercises. It was already loaded with approximately 60 pounds of gear, water, ammunition, communications equipment, and various other items designed to simulate combat load requirements. "Standard combat load," he announced to the assembled crowd, hefting the pack with theatrical effort. 60 pounds of essential equipment that every operator must be capable of carrying over extended distances in hostile territory. He placed the rucksack on the ground between himself and Rivera, then continued his impromptu lecture. "Now, you might think that 60 pounds isn't particularly challenging, but consider this. You're carrying this load after 3 days of limited sleep, in 100-degree heat, across terrain that varies from loose sand to rocky hillsides, while maintaining constant vigilance against enemy contact." His voice grew more animated as he spoke, feeding off the attention of his audience and the sense that he was finally regaining control of the situation. Add to that scenario the very real possibility that one of your teammates becomes injured and requires assistance, meaning you're now carrying additional weight, additional responsibility, additional burden on your already stressed physical systems. Hayes was pacing again, his movements becoming more aggressive and theatrical. "This isn't a gymnasium exercise with controlled conditions and safety protocols. This is life and death in the most unforgiving environments on Earth." Rivera stood quietly beside the rucksack, her posture relaxed but alert. She made no move to pick up the equipment, no gesture of impatience or eagerness to prove herself. Her silence was becoming increasingly infuriating to Hayes, who needed her to react. To show some sign of the nervousness or inadequacy he was certain lay beneath her calm exterior. But perhaps, Hayes continued, his tone becoming openly mocking, we're setting the bar too high. Perhaps we should start with something more manageable, something more appropriate for someone of your physical parameters. He reached into the equipment collection and withdrew a lighter training pack, one typically used for basic conditioning exercises. 25 pounds. Surely that's more realistic for what we can reasonably expect. The insult was clear and deliberate, and it landed like a physical blow among the assembled personnel. Several of the senior enlisted sailors felt their hands clench involuntarily, their professional discipline warring with their natural instinct to intervene on behalf of a fellow sailor being publicly humiliated. The visiting officers were now openly uncomfortable, exchanging glances that conveyed their growing disapproval of Hayes's conduct. Rivera's expression remained unchanged, but something subtle shifted in her posture, a slight adjustment in her stance that was almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but spoke volumes to anyone trained to read body language. It wasn't anger or defensiveness, but rather the minute recalibration of someone preparing for action. Like a spring being compressed just enough to store potential energy. Actually, sir, Rivera said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard without any increase in volume, I believe the standard combat load is more appropriate for this demonstration. She stepped forward and effortlessly shouldered the 60-pound rucksack, the movement so smooth and controlled that it appeared she was picking up an empty bag. The pack settled onto her frame as if it belonged there, and her posture remained perfectly straight and balanced. Hayes felt a flash of genuine surprise, followed immediately by renewed irritation. Once again, she had responded in a way that undermined his narrative, demonstrating capability where he expected limitation, showing confidence where he anticipated weakness. The crowd was beginning to murmur approvingly, and he could sense his control of the situation slipping away once more. Fine, he snapped, abandoning any pretense of measured instruction. Let's see how long that confidence lasts. He moved to another equipment rack and began pulling out additional items: ammunition cases, water containers, communications gear. Combat operations rarely involve carrying just the basic load. Equipment failures, casualty situations, mission requirements. All of these create additional demands that separate the truly capable from those who merely meet minimum standards. With each piece of equipment he added to a growing pile, Hayes's voice became more heated, more personal. 40 additional pounds of mission-essential gear. Now we're at 100 pounds total, a load that would challenge experienced male operators, let alone. He gestured dismissively at Rivera, his implication clear and insulting. The crowd was now openly uncomfortable with the direction of the demonstration. What had begun as a professional evaluation was clearly becoming a personal vendetta, a public humiliation disguised as training. Several of the visiting Pentagon officials were beginning to look genuinely concerned about what they were witnessing. And the assembled sailors were shifting restlessly, their loyalty divided between military protocol and basic human decency. Rivera calmly began adding the additional equipment to her load, her movements methodical and efficient. Each item was secured properly, distributed correctly, integrated seamlessly into her existing kit. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged despite the increasing weight. It was becoming increasingly clear that what Hayes considered a crushing burden was, for her, simply another piece of standard equipment. 100 pounds. She confirmed quietly when she had finished adjusting the load. Ready to proceed with the demonstration, sir. Hayes stared at her in disbelief and growing rage. Not only was she handling the load without apparent difficulty, but she was doing it with a competence and professionalism that made his own behavior look increasingly petty and vindictive. The crowd was no longer on his side. They were watching Rivera with growing admiration and respect, while their opinion of him was clearly deteriorating with each passing moment. It was at that moment, with his authority crumbling and his ego under assault, that Hayes made the decision that would end his military career and create a legend that would be told throughout the Pacific Fleet for years to come. Abandoning all pretense of professional conduct, all adherence to military protocol, all consideration for the consequences of his actions, he chose to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "We'll see how tough you really are," he snarled. And with that declaration, he drew back his leg and delivered a vicious kick directly into Rivera's stomach with enough force to double over a grown man. The assault was so sudden, so unexpected, so completely beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct that for a moment the entire courtyard fell into stunned silence. Hayes had just committed a career-ending act of violence against a subordinate in full view of the most senior military leadership present, and everyone watching knew that something irreversible had just occurred. The kick landed with a sickening thud that echoed across the silent courtyard like a gunshot. Hayes had put his full weight behind the blow, driving his boot into Rivera's midsection with enough force to shatter ribs and collapse lungs. It was the kind of strike designed to incapacitate, to break both body and spirit, to prove once and for all his dominance over what he perceived as an inferior opponent. For a split second that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire assembled crowd held its breath. The visiting Pentagon officials stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The sailors around the perimeter felt their stomachs drop as they realized they had just watched their commanding officer commit an act of assault that would destroy careers and potentially result in criminal charges. The humid Hawaiian air seemed to thicken with tension and disbelief. Hayes stood with his legs still extended, a triumphant sneer beginning to form on his face as he waited for Rivera to crumple, to cry out, to finally show the weakness and vulnerability he had been so certain lay beneath her composed exterior. He expected her to fold like every other subordinate who had ever challenged his authority, to collapse under the weight of his physical dominance and beg for mercy that would never come. But Rivera didn't fall. The 100 pounds of equipment she carried shifted slightly as her body absorbed the impact, but she remained upright, her stance barely altered by the vicious blow. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. She stood there like a monument to controlled power, as if Hayes had kicked a steel pylon rather than a human being. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Rivera moved. What followed was not an explosion of rage or a wild counterattack born of pain and anger. It was something far more terrifying, a demonstration of precision violence so controlled and efficient that it redefined everyone's understanding of what human capability could look like when properly trained and unleashed. Rivera's response began with a movement so subtle that most observers missed it entirely. As Hayes's leg began to retract from his kick, she shifted her weight forward just enough to trap his foot against her body for a fraction of a second, not enough to hold him, but enough to disrupt his balance as he tried to regain his stance. It was a tiny adjustment that threw off his center of gravity in a way he couldn't immediately compensate for. While Hayes struggled to maintain his footing, Rivera's right hand moved in a precise arc that terminated at a specific point on his extended leg just above the knee. To the untrained eye, it looked like she had simply reached out and touched him. In reality, she had delivered a precisely calculated strike to the common peroneal nerve, with exactly the right amount of pressure to cause temporary paralysis of his lower leg without permanent damage. Hayes's leg buckled instantly, not from pain but from complete neuromuscular shutdown. His face went white with shock as he realized he could no longer feel or control his right leg below the knee. He began to fall, his arms windmilling as he tried to maintain balance. But Rivera was already moving to her next objective. As Hayes toppled forward, Rivera stepped to his left side with the fluid grace of a dancer and the deadly precision of a surgeon. Her movement was so smooth that she seemed to glide rather than step. the 100 pounds of equipment she carried appearing weightless as she repositioned herself. Her left hand came up in what appeared to be a supporting gesture, as if she were trying to help him regain his balance. Instead, her fingers found the brachial plexus cluster at the junction of his neck and shoulder, applying pressure to a collection of nerves that controlled his dominant arm. The technique required intimate knowledge of human anatomy combined with the finger strength that came from thousands of hours of specialized training. Hayes's left arm went completely numb, hanging uselessly at his side as his nervous system processed the carefully applied neurological shutdown, still maintaining the illusion that she was somehow helping rather than systematically dismantling him. Rivera continued her movement. As Hayes's body betrayed him and he fell forward, she guided his descent with terrifying precision, using his own momentum against him while maintaining complete control of the engagement. Her right arm snaked around his throat, not in a crude chokehold but in a perfectly executed blood choke that compressed the carotid arteries without putting dangerous pressure on his windpipe. Simultaneously, her left hand secured the back of his head, creating a vice-like grip that gave her absolute control over his position and movement. Hayes hit the ground hard, but not with the uncontrolled crash he should have experienced. Rivera had guided his fall, managing his descent so that he landed exactly where and how she wanted him to, flat on his back with her kneeling beside him in a position of complete dominance. The 100 pounds of gear she carried had never shifted, never unbalanced her, never interfered with the flowing sequence of movements that had transformed her from victim to victor in less than 3 seconds. The pressure Rivera applied to Hayes's carotid arteries was precise and measured. She wasn't trying to render him unconscious, that would have been merciful. Instead, she was applying just enough pressure to cause confusion and disorientation, while leaving him completely aware of his helplessness. Hayes's vision began to gray at the edges. His thoughts became sluggish and unfocused, but he remained conscious enough to fully comprehend the magnitude of his situation. "Sir," Rivera said quietly, her voice so calm and controlled that it seemed to come from another world entirely, "I believe this concludes the physical fitness demonstration." The words were spoken with the same professional courtesy she might have used to report the completion of a routine training exercise. There was no anger in her voice, no triumph, no emotion at all. It was the voice of someone who had simply finished a job, completed a task that required no more mental energy than filing paperwork or conducting equipment inventory. Hayes lay beneath her, his mind reeling as he tried to process what had just happened to him. Minutes earlier, he had been the commanding presence, the authority figure who controlled the situation and commanded respect through rank and position. Now he was flat on his back, partially paralyzed, struggling to think clearly, completely at the mercy of the woman he had just assaulted. The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed with their understanding of reality. The transformation had been so swift, so complete, so devastatingly efficient that many of them were still processing the fact that it had actually occurred. They had just watched a 100-pound woman carrying 100 pounds of equipment effortlessly neutralize a much larger male officer who had attacked her without warning. But perhaps most shocking of all was Rivera's demeanor throughout the entire encounter. She showed no signs of exertion, no indication that she had just engaged in combat, no evidence that what had occurred was anything more than a routine training exercise. Her breathing remained steady, her expression unchanged, her focus absolute. As Hayes lay gasping on the hot concrete of the courtyard, staring up at the calm, impassive face of the woman who had just systematically dismantled every assumption he had ever held about strength, capability, and combat effectiveness, he began to realize that he had made an error far more catastrophic than a simple lapse in judgment. He had just discovered that some people's silence isn't a sign of weakness, it's a warning that smart people learn to heed. And he had ignored that warning in the most public and humiliating way possible, in front of witnesses whose opinions could shape military policy and end careers. The morning sun continued to beat down on Naval Station Pearl Harbor, But the world had fundamentally changed in the space of 3 seconds, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. From the shaded entrance of the training facility's main building, a figure emerged with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Admiral Sarah Chen stepped into the blazing Hawaiian sunlight. Her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she surveyed the scene before her with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 4 decades navigating the complexities of military leadership. Admiral Chen was not supposed to be at Pearl Harbor that morning. Her visit had been unscheduled, a last-minute addition to her Pacific Fleet inspection tour that had brought her to the islands to review training protocols and assess readiness standards. She had arrived early, intending to observe the demonstrations without fanfare, to see how the Navy's elite training programs functioned when they believed no one was watching from the highest levels of command. What she had witnessed instead was a masterclass in everything that could go wrong when ego and prejudice collided with genuine capability. Standing in the doorway, she had watched the entire confrontation unfold from Hayes's initial provocations through Rivera's surgical dismantling of his authority. Now, as she stepped fully into the courtyard, her presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the space. Chen was a small woman, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with silver-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and a face that bore the weathered lines of someone who had spent considerable time at sea in all kinds of weather. Her uniform was immaculate but showed the subtle signs of actual use, rather than ceremonial display. The slight fading that came from salt air and sun, the perfect fit that spoke of practical experience rather than tailor shop precision. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every star on her collar through competence rather than politics. Behind Chen came her aide, Commander Michael Torres, a young officer whose tablet was already active, as he began documenting what would undoubtedly become one of the most significant incidents in recent Pacific Fleet history. Torres had been with the Admiral long enough to recognize the particular quality of stillness that preceded her most decisive actions. He had seen that look when she had relieved commanding officers for cause, when she had testified before Congress about fleet readiness, when she had made decisions that affected thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in resources. The crowd in the courtyard began to sense the shift in dynamics before they consciously recognized Chen's presence. Conversations died in mid-sentence, postures straightened unconsciously, and the nervous energy that had permeated the space following Rivera's demonstration was replaced by the focused attention that always accompanied the arrival of flag-rank authority. When Admiral Chen finally spoke, her voice carried easily across the courtyard despite its moderate volume. It was the kind of voice that commanded attention not through force, but through the accumulated weight of experience and the absolute certainty that came from someone who had earned the right to speak with authority on matters of military conduct and capability. "As you were, everyone," she said simply, her words cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "Continue with your duties." The assembled personnel began to disperse slowly, but Chen raised a hand that stopped the movement without seeming to exert any effort at all. "Except for you, Lieutenant Commander Hayes. And you, Petty Officer Rivera. You'll remain exactly where you are." Hayes, still struggling to regain full sensation in his extremities while lying flat on his back, felt a cold dread settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with Rivera's continuing control of the situation. He recognized Chen's voice from briefings and official ceremonies, and he knew with absolute certainty that his career had just taken a turn toward complete catastrophe. Rivera maintained her position of control over Hayes, but Chen could see the subtle way her posture shifted to acknowledge the presence of flag-rank authority. It wasn't a visible change. Her grip didn't loosen, her focus didn't waver, her professional demeanor remained constant, but there was a microscopic adjustment that spoke of someone who understood exactly how military hierarchy functioned at every level. Chen approached the pair with measured steps, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene. She noted the precision of Rivera's positioning, the calculated nature of her restraint techniques, the complete absence of unnecessary force or vindictive behavior. She observed Hayes's partial paralysis and the specific nature of his incapacitation: nerve strikes rather than bone breaks, control techniques rather than damage-dealing blows. Most importantly, she recognized the equipment Rivera was wearing and the specific nature of her load-bearing configuration. Chen had spent enough time with special operations personnel to recognize the subtle differences between standard military gear and the specialized equipment used by elite units. Rivera's kit wasn't just regulation, it was operational, configured in a way that spoke of recent field experience and intimate familiarity with mission-specific requirements. "Commander Torres," Chen said without taking her eyes off the two figures on the ground, "I want you to access Petty Officer Rivera's complete personnel file. Full classification access. I want her entire service record, training history, deployment record, and command evaluations. Everything." Torres's fingers moved quickly across his tablet screen, navigating through multiple security protocols and clearance levels. The device's biometric scanners confirmed his identity and authorization, while encrypted communications channels established secure connections to personnel databases located in heavily protected facilities thousands of miles away. As Torres worked, Chen continued her visual assessment of the situation. She knelt down beside Hayes, studying his condition with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen combat casualties in every conceivable form. His breathing was labored, but steady. His pupils were reactive, and his color was beginning to return to normal as the initial shock of the encounter wore off. "Lieutenant Commander," Chen said quietly, her voice carrying a tone that made Hayes's blood run cold, "I want you to explain to me exactly what you thought you were accomplishing here today." Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but found that his thoughts were still too scattered and his breathing too unsteady to formulate a coherent response. The neurological effects of Rivera's strikes were beginning to fade, but the psychological impact of his situation was growing more severe with each passing moment. "Take your time," Chen continued with the patience of someone who had all day to wait for an answer. "But when you do speak, I want you to remember that I observed this entire incident from beginning to end. I saw your initial provocation, your escalation of hostilities, and your assault on a subordinate. I want you to think very carefully about how you choose to characterize those actions." Torres looked up from his tablet, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes reflecting the significance of what he was reading. "Admiral," he said quietly, "the file is extensive. Multiple classification levels. I'm going to need a few minutes to review the material properly." Chen nodded once, her attention still focused on Hayes. Around them, the courtyard had taken on the quality of a crime scene, with the remaining personnel maintaining a respectful distance while making no move to actually leave the area. They all understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment when the normal rules of military conduct had been suspended in favor of something far more fundamental. "Petty Officer Rivera," Chen said, finally directing her attention to the woman who still maintained perfect control over the situation, "I'm going to ask you to release Lieutenant Commander Hayes and step back, but I want you to remain in the immediate area. We're going to have a very detailed conversation about what occurred here today." Rivera nodded once and began to disengage from Hayes with the same fluid precision she had used to subdue him. Her movements were careful and controlled, ensuring that he was stable and uninjured before she withdrew her restraint. As she stepped back, the 100 pounds of equipment she carried seemed to settle into place as if it were part of her natural configuration. Hayes struggled to his feet, his movements unsteady as sensation gradually returned to his affected limbs. His face was flushed with embarrassment and growing terror as he began to fully comprehend the magnitude of his situation. He had committed assault in front of flag-rank witnesses, and the woman he had attacked had responded with a level of capability that suggested connections and credentials far beyond anything reflected in her apparent rank. Admiral Chen watched him regain his footing with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. Her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts or intentions, but there was something in her eyes that suggested Hayes's problems were only beginning. The morning sun climbed higher over Pearl Harbor, casting sharp shadows across a scene that would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered for years to come. In a few minutes, Torres would finish reviewing Rivera's classified records, and the true scope of Hayes's error would become clear to everyone present. But for now, in the growing heat of the Hawaiian morning, Admiral Chen simply waited with the patience of someone who understood that the most important moments in military history often unfolded not in the chaos of battle, but in the quiet aftermath, when truth finally emerged from the fog of assumptions and prejudice. Commander Torres's tablet chimed softly as the final security clearances were processed, granting him access to personnel files that existed in the most protected databases of the United States military. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly as the first pages of data appeared on his screen, and Admiral Chen noticed the subtle change in his expression immediately. "What do you have, Commander?" Chen asked, her voice maintaining its measured tone despite the growing tension in the courtyard. Torres cleared his throat softly, glancing between his tablet and Rivera before speaking. "Admiral, the file indicates that Petty Officer Rivera is, well, she's not actually Petty Officer Rivera." He paused, double-checking the information on his screen. "Her current assignment designation is Master Chief Special Warfare Operator Carmen Rivera, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." A collective intake of breath echoed across the courtyard as the implications of Torres's words sank in. Naval Special Warfare Development Group (DevGru) was the formal designation for what most people knew as SEAL Team 6, the most elite counterterrorism unit in the American military. These were the SE Team operators who conducted the most sensitive and dangerous missions in the world. Personnel so highly classified that their very existence was often a matter of national security. Hayes felt his legs go weak as the reality of his situation crashed over him like a tsunami. He had not just assaulted a subordinate, he had attacked one of the most highly trained and lethal operators in the entire United States military. The woman standing quietly before him, still carrying 100 pounds of gear as if it weighed nothing, was part of a unit so exclusive that fewer than 300 people in the world were qualified to serve in its ranks. Admiral Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but something shifted in her posture that suggested she was reassessing everything she had observed. "Continue reading, Commander," she said quietly. Torres scrolled through the digital pages, his voice becoming more strained with each revelation. Deployment history shows 7 combat tours across of multiple classified theaters of operation. Special qualifications include Advanced Close Quarters Battle Instructor, Master Breacher, High Altitude Low Opening Specialist, and... He paused, looking up at Chen with an expression of amazement. Advanced Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape Instructor Certification. She's qualified to train other special operations personnel. The courtyard had fallen into absolute silence as the assembled personnel struggled to reconcile the unassuming woman before them with the extraordinary service record being read aloud. Rivera herself showed no reaction to the recitation of her achievements, maintaining the same calm, professional demeanor she had displayed throughout the entire encounter. "Mission record," Torres continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, "is almost entirely classified, but the summary indicates participation in high-value target operations, hostage rescue missions, and direct action raids against priority terrorism targets. She has received multiple commendations for valor under fire, including..." He stopped reading abruptly, his face going pale. "Including what, Commander?" Chen prompted. "Including the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a classified operation that resulted in the successful rescue of American hostages from a terrorist stronghold," Torres finished quietly. "The citation indicates she single-handedly neutralized multiple armed hostiles and extracted wounded teammates under direct enemy fire." Hayes staggered backward as if he had been struck a physical blow. The Navy Cross was the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military, awarded only to those who displayed extraordinary heroism in the face of extreme danger. The woman he had kicked and attempted to humiliate was not just an elite operator, she was a decorated war hero whose courage and capability had been tested and proven in actual combat against real enemies. Admiral Chen turned her attention fully to Rivera, studying her with new understanding. "Master Chief," she said, using Rivera's actual rank for the first time, "would you mind explaining why you're here at Pearl Harbor conducting training demonstrations instead of—" She gestured vaguely, acknowledging the classified nature of DevGru operations without speaking specifics. Rivera stood at attention, her posture perfect despite the massive load she carried. "Admiral, I'm currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command as a liaison for advanced combat training development. My role involves evaluating and improving training protocols across all Naval Special Operations units. This demonstration was intended to assess current physical fitness standards and instructional methodologies." Her voice remained steady and professional, but Chen could detect the subtle undertones that suggested there was more to the story. Rivera's presence at what should have been a routine training event was beginning to make more sense. She hadn't been randomly selected for Hayes's demonstration. She had been observing and evaluating, conducting her own assessment of training quality and instructor competence. "And what was your assessment of today's training methodologies, Master Chief?" Chen asked, her tone carrying implications that everyone present understood perfectly. Rivera considered the question for a moment before responding. "Admiral, I observed significant deficiencies in leadership approach, inappropriate use of rank for personal agenda, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between physical capability and operational effectiveness." She paused briefly. "I also noted a concerning pattern of behavior that would be considered unacceptable in any professional military environment." The clinical precision of her assessment hit Hayes like a physical blow. She wasn't just describing what had happened. She was providing an official evaluation that would become part of the permanent record. Every word she spoke was being documented by Torres, creating a trail of evidence that would follow Hayes for the remainder of his military career. Commander Torres looked up from his tablet again, his expression increasingly grave. "Admiral, there's more. Master Chief Rivera's current assignment includes full authority to recommend personnel actions based on her observations. Her evaluations carry the same weight as a formal Inspector General's report." Chen nodded slowly, the full scope of the situation becoming clear. Rivera hadn't just been an innocent victim of Hayes's prejudice and assault. She had been an official observer with the authority to evaluate and report on exactly the kind of behavior Hayes had displayed. His actions hadn't just been witnessed by random personnel. They had been officially documented by someone whose job was specifically to identify and report such conduct. "Master Chief Rivera," Chen said formally, "I'm ordering you to prepare a complete written report of today's events, including your professional assessment of Lieutenant Commander Hayes's conduct and its impact on unit readiness and morale. I want that report on my desk within 24 hours." "Understood, Admiral," Rivera replied. "The report will include video documentation from my personal recording equipment, as well as detailed analysis of the training methodologies observed and specific recommendations for corrective action." Hayes's face went ashen as he realized that Rivera had been recording the entire encounter. Not only had his assault been witnessed by dozens of personnel and visiting officials, but it had been documented by high-definition recording equipment operated by one of the military's most elite professionals. His career wasn't just over, it was about to become a case study in how not to conduct military training. Admiral Chen turned her attention back to Hayes, who was swaying slightly on his feet as the full magnitude of his situation continued to sink in. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you are hereby relieved of all training responsibilities pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will report to my aide within the hour to begin formal proceedings that will determine the continuation of your military career." The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the courtyard, but Hayes felt cold to his bones as he realized that everything he had worked for, everything he had believed about himself, and his place in the military hierarchy, had been destroyed in a matter of minutes by his own arrogance and prejudice. Standing before him, Master Chief Carmen Rivera remained at attention, her 100 pounds of gear perfectly balanced, her breathing steady, her demeanor unchanged. She had not sought this confrontation, had not wanted to destroy Hayes's career, had simply been doing her job when he chose to assault her based on his own flawed assumptions about her capabilities and worth. The truth had been revealed, and it was more devastating than anyone present could have imagined. Admiral Chen's aide stepped forward with a precision that spoke of long practice in handling career-ending situations. Commander Torres had closed his tablet and now held it against his chest like a shield, knowing that the device contained documentation that would reshape multiple lives and potentially influence military policy at the highest levels. The morning air seemed to thicken with the weight of institutional consequence as Chen prepared to restore order to a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's control. "Master Chief Rivera," Admiral Chen said, her voice carrying the formal authority of someone about to render institutional justice, "on behalf of the United States Navy and the Pacific Fleet Command Structure, I want to express my profound regret for the unprofessional conduct you have endured today. Your service record speaks to a level of dedication and capability that deserves the highest respect from every member of this organization." Chen's words carried across the courtyard with deliberate clarity, ensuring that every witness understood they were hearing an official apology from the highest levels of naval command. It was not just an acknowledgement of Hayes's misconduct, but a formal recognition of Rivera's status and achievements that had been so egregiously dismissed and attacked. Rivera maintained her position of attention, but Chen could see the subtle way her posture shifted to acknowledge the significance of the moment. "Thank you, Admiral," she replied simply. "I appreciate the Navy's commitment to maintaining professional standards." Her response was measured and appropriate. But Chen detected something else beneath the surface, a quiet satisfaction that justice was being served, tempered by the professional restraint of someone who understood that true victory lay not in personal vindication but in the preservation of institutional integrity. Chen turned her attention to Hayes, who stood swaying slightly as he struggled to process the complete reversal of his circumstances. Minutes earlier, he had been the commanding presence, the authority figure dictating terms to what he perceived as an inferior subordinate. Now he faced the end of his military career, public humiliation, and potentially criminal charges for assault. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," Chen said, her voice taking on the cold formality reserved for the most serious breaches of military conduct, "you are hereby formally relieved of all command responsibilities, effective immediately. Your conduct today represents a fundamental failure of leadership, judgment, and basic military courtesy that cannot and will not be tolerated at any level of this organization." Hayes opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to offer some explanation or justification for his actions, but Chen continued before he could form words. "You will surrender your training facility access credentials to Commander Torres immediately. You will report to Base Legal Services within the next hour to begin formal administrative proceedings. And you will have no contact with Master Chief Rivera or any personnel who witnessed today's events until this matter has been fully resolved through proper channels." The finality in Chen's voice left no room for argument, or negotiation. Hayes was being processed through the military justice system with the efficiency of a machine designed specifically for such situations. His future would now be determined by formal boards, legal reviews, and administrative procedures that would examine every aspect of his conduct and character. Commander Torres stepped forward with a tablet displaying official forms that would document Hayes's relief from duty. "Sir, I need you to acknowledge receipt of these orders and surrender your facility credentials," he said with professional courtesy that somehow made Hayes's situation feel even more humiliating. Hayes fumbled for his identification cards and access badges with hands that shook slightly from residual nerve damage and growing shock. The simple act of removing credentials from his uniform seemed to take an eternity, each movement highlighting his physical vulnerability and the complete collapse of his authority. When he finally handed the items to Torres, it felt like surrendering the last vestiges of his military identity. Admiral Chen watched the exchange with the detached attention of someone who had overseen similar proceedings many times throughout her career. She had seen good officers make terrible decisions, watched promising careers destroyed by moments of poor judgment, and observed the institutional mechanisms that existed to protect the integrity of military service from those who would abuse their position. "Master Chief Rivera," Chen said, shifting her focus back to the woman who had catalyzed this entire sequence of events through her competence and composure, "I'm assigning you temporary authority over all advanced combat training protocols at this facility, until a permanent replacement for Lieutenant Commander Hayes can be identified and briefed on current procedures." Appointment was both a recognition of Rivera's qualifications and a practical necessity. Someone with her level of expertise and official authority would be needed to ensure that training standards were maintained while the facility recovered from the leadership vacuum created by Hayes's removal. It also served as a visible demonstration to all personnel present that competence and character, rather than rank or prejudice, determined who was truly qualified for positions of responsibility. Rivera nodded once in acknowledgement. "Understood, Admiral. I'll conduct a complete review of current training methodologies and provide recommendations for any necessary improvements." Her acceptance of the additional responsibility was delivered with the same professional calm she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. To the observers, it was becoming clear that Rivera's capabilities extended far beyond combat skills. She possessed the leadership qualities and institutional knowledge necessary to manage complex training operations at the highest levels. Chen addressed the assembled personnel who had remained in the courtyard, witnessing history unfold before their eyes. "I want everyone present to understand that what you observed today represents both the best and worst of military culture," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the space. "You witnessed an unacceptable abuse of authority based on prejudice and assumption, but you also witnessed the quiet professionalism and extraordinary capability that represents the true strength of our armed forces." The crowd listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were receiving guidance that would influence their own conduct and careers for years to come. Chen's words were being permanently recorded in their memories as a defining moment that clarified the difference between leadership and authority, between strength and bullying, between earned respect and demanded obedience. Master Chief Rivera's response to an unprovoked assault demonstrated not just her individual capabilities, but the values and training that make our special operations forces the most respected in the world. Chen continued. Her restraint, her professionalism, and her commitment to mission accomplishment even under direct attack represent the standard we expect from every member of this organization. Hayes stood listening to this praise with the growing realization that his assault on Rivera had not just been wrong, it had been strategically catastrophic. He had attacked someone whose capabilities far exceeded his own, whose service record dwarfed his achievements, and whose professional conduct under pressure had just been publicly commended by a flag officer in front of witnesses who would remember this moment for the rest of their careers. Admiral Chen concluded her remarks by addressing the institutional lessons that would emerge from this incident. Effective immediately, I'm directing a complete review of leadership training protocols throughout the Pacific Fleet. Today's events will become a case study in decision-making, respect for fellow service members, and the consequences of allowing personal prejudice to override professional judgment. As Chen spoke these final words, Hayes understood that his actions would not simply end his own career, they would become a cautionary tale told to future generations of naval officers. His name would be associated with failure, prejudice, and the catastrophic consequences of underestimating quiet competence. The transformation was complete. Justice had been served with the swift efficiency that characterized military administration at its best, and the institution had demonstrated its commitment to protecting those who served with honor while holding accountable those who violated the trust placed in them. In the growing heat of the Hawaiian morning, the United States Navy had reaffirmed its values through decisive action that would resonate throughout the fleet for years to come. The story of what happened in the Pearl Harbor training courtyard that sweltering morning spread through the Pacific Fleet like wildfire racing across dry grassland. Within hours of Admiral Chen's departure, the basic facts had reached every mess hall, barracks, and ready room from San Diego to Yokosuka. By the end of the week, variations of the tale had made their way to naval installations around the globe, each retelling adding new layers of detail and mythology to what was already becoming one of the most significant incidents in recent fleet history. The initial wave of information traveled through official channels with the clinical precision of military communication. Incident reports, personnel actions, and administrative notifications moved up and down the chain of command, documenting the facts in the sterile language of bureaucracy. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had been relieved for cause. Master Chief Rivera had been assigned additional duties. Admiral Chen had ordered a comprehensive review of training protocols. The paperwork told the story, but it couldn't capture the human drama that had unfolded or the broader implications for naval culture. The unofficial version of events moved through different channels entirely, spreading through the informal networks that connected sailors across the world. It traveled in encrypted messages between shipmates, in phone calls between old friends serving on different continents, in the whispered conversations that took place in spaces where junior personnel felt safe to speak freely about their experiences and observations. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos was working the night shift in the communications center when the first detailed account reached her station. She had served with Rivera during a deployment 2 years earlier and immediately recognized the description of the quiet professional who had humiliated an arrogant officer. Santos spent the remainder of her watch carefully documenting everything she could learn about the incident. Knowing that her shipmates would want to hear every detail when she briefed them during the morning shift change. "You're telling me that Hayes actually kicked her?" asked Petty Officer Second Class James Mitchell when Santos finished her account. "He physically assaulted a DevGru operator in front of visiting Pentagon brass?" Santos nodded grimly. "According to 3 different sources, including someone who was standing close enough to hear bones crack when she put him on the deck. The man thought he was demonstrating physical standards to some quiet female sailor. Turns out he was assaulting one of the most lethal people in the entire military." The story gained momentum as it moved from person to person, each telling adding new details based on secondary sources, eyewitness accounts, and the natural human tendency to embellish dramatic events. The basic facts remained consistent. Hayes had underestimated Rivera based on her gender and apparent rank, had escalated to physical violence, and had been neutralized with devastating efficiency, but the specifics evolved with each retelling. In some versions, Rivera had been carrying 200 pounds of equipment instead of 100. In others, Hayes had attempted multiple attacks before being subdued. Several accounts included dramatic dialogue that may or may not have been spoken, quotable moments that captured the essence of the confrontation even if the exact words had been lost or imagined. What remained constant across all versions was the profound impact the incident had on those who heard it. For female personnel throughout the fleet, Rivera's story became a source of inspiration and validation. Here was proof that competence and training could overcome prejudice and physical intimidation, that the quiet professional approach could triumph over loud arrogance, that their service and sacrifice were recognized and valued by the highest levels of command. Seaman apprentice Rebecca Foster was completing her 2nd week of basic training when her instructor used the Pearl Harbor incident as a teaching moment during a leadership class. "This is what happens when you make assumptions about your shipmates based on their appearance or background," the instructor explained. Master Chief Rivera didn't need to prove herself to anyone. Her record spoke for itself. But when someone forced a confrontation based on ignorance and prejudice, She responded with exactly the level of professionalism and capability we expect from our most elite personnel. Foster raised her hand tentatively. "Chief, what happened to the officer? Who attacked her?" The instructor's expression grew serious. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes is no longer in the Navy. His career ended the moment he decided that his personal opinions were more important than treating a fellow service member with respect. The lesson here is that rank doesn't give you permission to abuse subordinates, and assumptions can destroy careers faster than enemy action." Throughout the fleet, the Rivera incident became a touchstone for discussions about respect, professionalism, and the changing nature of military service. Training commands began incorporating the story into their curricula, using it as a case study in leadership failure and the importance of treating all personnel with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. At the Naval War College in Newport, Professor Captain David Kim included the incident in his advanced leadership course, presenting it as an example of how personal prejudice could compromise institutional effectiveness. Hayes's failure wasn't just moral, he explained to his class of senior officers. It was tactical and strategic. He wasted institutional resources on personal vendettas, created unnecessary conflict within his command, and ultimately damaged the Navy's reputation in front of visiting dignitaries and Allied observers. The story reached international audiences as well, spreading through the informal networks that connected special operations personnel across Allied nations. British SAS operators, Australian Special Air Service members, and Canadian Joint Task Force 2 personnel heard variations of the tale during joint training exercises and multinational conferences. The basic message resonated across cultural and national boundaries. Quiet competence was universal, and those who underestimated skilled professionals did so at their own peril. Master Chief Rivera herself remained largely unaware of her growing legend. She had submitted her official report to Admiral Chen as requested, documenting Hayes's conduct with clinical precision and recommending specific changes to training protocols that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Her focus remained on mission accomplishment and professional duties, the same approach that had characterized her entire military career. The administrative review of training protocols that Admiral Chen had ordered progressed with typical military thoroughness. Committees were formed, procedures were analyzed, and recommendations were developed for improving leadership training and preventing abuse of authority. Rivera's incident report became the foundation for new guidelines that emphasized respect for all personnel and established clear consequences for officers who allowed personal prejudice to influence their professional conduct. But beyond the official procedures and administrative changes, the story of Master Chief Carmen Rivera continued to spread and evolve, becoming something larger than the sum of its parts. It became a symbol of institutional values, a reminder that the Navy's strength lay not in its hardware or technology, but in the character and capability of the men and women who served. In ready rooms and mess halls, in training facilities, and deployed units around the world, sailors would continue to tell the story of the quiet professional who had faced down prejudice and violence with calm competence. It would become a teaching tool, an inspiration, and a warning that assumptions about capability based on appearance could have devastating consequences for those who made them. The ripple effects of that humid morning at Pearl Harbor would continue to influence naval culture for years to come, ensuring that Master Chief Rivera's legacy extended far beyond her individual achievements to shape the institution she had served with such quiet distinction. 3 years after the incident that had transformed Master Chief Carmen Rivera from an anonymous professional into a fleet-wide legend, the institutional changes Admiral Chen had ordered were beginning to reshape naval culture in ways both subtle and profound. The administrative machinery of the United States Navy had processed the lessons learned from that humid morning at Pearl Harbor and converted them into policy, training protocols, and cultural shifts that would influence military service for generations to come. The most visible change came in the form of the Respectful Leadership Initiative, a comprehensive program that was now mandatory for all officers from ensign to admiral. The training centered on case studies of leadership failures, with the Hayes-Rivera incident serving as the primary example of how personal prejudice could destroy careers and compromise operational effectiveness. Officers attending the program were required to analyze Hayes's decision-making process, identify the warning signs that preceded his catastrophic failure, and develop strategies for maintaining professional standards regardless of personal opinions or biases. Captain Jessica Wright, who had been assigned to develop the curriculum, found herself returning repeatedly to the security footage of Rivera's response to Hayes's assault. The video, which had become classified training material available only to senior leadership, demonstrated a level of controlled violence and professional restraint that exemplified everything the Navy wanted its personnel to embody. "What makes this incident so instructionally valuable," Wright explained to a class of newly promoted commanders, "is not just the dramatic nature of the confrontation, but the way Master Chief Rivera maintained absolute professionalism throughout the entire encounter. She didn't respond with anger or seek revenge. She neutralized a threat with exactly the minimum force necessary, then immediately returned to her assigned duties." The video analysis sessions had become some of the most requested training modules in the entire naval time education system. Officers would watch Rivera's 3-second response sequence frame by frame, studying the biomechanics of her movements, the precision of her targeting, and the controlled application of force that left Hayes incapacitated but uninjured. Combat instructors throughout the fleet had begun incorporating her techniques into their curricula, creating a new generation of fighters trained in what had become known informally as the Rivera method. But the changes extended far beyond combat training. The incident had highlighted systemic issues in how the Navy evaluated and promoted its personnel, leading to comprehensive reforms in performance assessment and leadership development. The traditional emphasis on appearance, conformity, and vocal self-promotion was being balanced with new metrics that valued competence, restraint, and the kind of quiet professionalism that Rivera exemplified. Master Chief Robert Chen, no relation to Admiral Chen, had been selected to oversee implementation of the new evaluation standards at Naval Special Warfare Command. His office walls displayed charts tracking the correlation between traditional promotion metrics and actual operational performance, data that supported what many had suspected but never been able to prove statistically. The Hayes incident gave us the political cover we needed to challenge some long-standing assumptions about leadership potential, Chen explained during a briefing to Pentagon officials. "We discovered that many of our most effective operators were being overlooked for advancement because they didn't fit traditional profiles of military leadership. They were too quiet, too focused on mission accomplishment, too unwilling to engage in the kind of self-promotion that had become synonymous with career advancement." The new evaluation criteria emphasized demonstrated competence under pressure, peer evaluations from those who had served alongside candidates in operational environments, and specific assessments of how personnel treated subordinates and teammates. Officers like Hayes, whose leadership style depended on intimidation and hierarchy rather than respect and competence, found their career prospects significantly diminished under the reformed system. The ripple effects extended to recruitment and retention as well. The Navy's Public Affairs Office had carefully managed the release of information about the Rivera incident, ensuring that the story reached target demographics without compromising operational security. Young women considering military service saw in Rivera's example proof that excellence would be recognized and protected, that they could serve alongside the most elite units in the world if they possessed the necessary skills and determination. Recruitment numbers for female candidates applying to special operations programs had increased by 47% in the 2 years following the incident. More importantly, completion rates for those programs had improved as well, suggesting that the institutional culture shifts were creating environments where diverse personnel could thrive rather than merely survive. Lieutenant Sarah Kim had been one of those inspired by Rivera's story to pursue naval aviation. specifically the demanding process of becoming a carrier-qualified fighter pilot. During her final qualification flights, she found herself thinking about the quiet competence that had made Rivera so effective and dangerous. "I realized that the loudest pilot in the ready room isn't necessarily the best stick," Kim reflected during her post-flight debrief. "The ones you need to watch are like Rivera. They don't need to tell you how good they are because their performance speaks for itself. They're the ones who stay calm when everything goes wrong, who solve problems instead of creating drama, who make everyone around them better just by example." The cultural transformation was perhaps most visible in the naval training commands, where the Hayes incident had become a foundational case study. New instructors were required to complete modules on respectful leadership and bias recognition before being certified to train junior personnel. The curriculum emphasized that effective instruction required challenging students without demeaning them, pushing for excellence without resorting to prejudice or personal attack. Admiral Chen herself had been promoted to Chief of Naval Operations, a position that allowed her to institutionalize the changes she had initiated at Pearl Harbor. Her office maintained a discreet plaque commemorating the incident, not as a celebration of conflict, but as a reminder that institutional strength came from protecting and empowering the most capable personnel, regardless of their background or appearance. During her confirmation hearings before Congress, Chen had been asked about the military's evolving approach to diversity and inclusion. Her response had become required reading for senior military leaders across all service branches. "Excellence has no gender, no color, no predetermined appearance," she had testified. "The Master Chief Riveras of our military come in many forms, and our job as leaders is to create environments where their capabilities can flourish. When we allow prejudice to override performance, when we mistake appearance for ability, we weaken our own institutions and betray the trust our nation places in us." The training facility at Pearl Harbor had been renamed the Rivera Advanced Combat Training Center, a designation that surprised many who expected more traditional military naming conventions. The courtyard where the original incident had occurred now featured a simple bronze marker embedded in the concrete, inscribed with the words, "Quiet Competence," in both English and Spanish. Young sailors completing their initial training would often pause at the marker, many of them only vaguely aware of the specific events it commemorated but understanding that it represented something important about military service and professional conduct. Their instructors would explain that true strength didn't need to announce itself, that the most dangerous opponents were often the most unassuming, and that respect was earned through action rather than demanded through authority. The legacy of that humid morning continued to evolve and expand, touching every aspect of naval culture and extending its influence throughout the broader military community. Master Chief Rivera had unknowingly catalyzed a transformation that would benefit countless future service members who would never face the kind of prejudice and abuse that she had encountered and overcome with such devastating efficiency. Her quiet competence had become an institutional standard. Her restraint under attack had become a model for professional conduct, and her 3-second demonstration of elite capability had become a permanent reminder that assumptions about others could be more dangerous than any external enemy. In the end, Master Chief Carmen Rivera's legacy transcended the specific circumstances of that sweltering morning at Pearl Harbor and became something far more profound than a single story of conflict and consequence. Her 3-second response to Lieutenant Commander Hayes's assault had revealed fundamental truths about human nature, institutional strength, and the quiet power that exists in those who need no validation from others to know their own worth. The incident had begun as a simple case of prejudice and assumption, a peacetime officer mistaking rank for competence, confusing appearance with capability, and believing that his position granted him the right to humiliate those he perceived as inferior. But it had evolved into something that challenged every observer to examine their own biases, their own assumptions about strength and weakness, their own understanding of what it meant to serve with honor in an institution dedicated to protecting others. Hayes's career had ended not just because he had committed assault, but because he had embodied everything wrong with leadership that prioritized ego over mission, appearance over substance, loud authority over quiet competence. His failure became a cautionary tale told throughout the military, a reminder that the most dangerous enemy of effective organizations was not external threats but internal corruption of values and character. Rivera, by contrast, had demonstrated through her actions that true strength lay in restraint, that real power came from competence rather than dominance, and that the most effective warriors were often those who least resembled the stereotypes that civilians and even fellow service members carried about military excellence. Her calm professionalism under attack had shown that courage was not the absence of fear, but the disciplined channeling of energy toward mission accomplishment, regardless of personal cost. The broader implications of her story reached far beyond military culture. In corporate boardrooms, university classrooms, and community organizations around the world, leaders began using the Rivera incident as a framework for understanding how unconscious bias could undermine institutional effectiveness. Her example became a teaching tool for demonstrating that diversity was not a social experiment but a strategic advantage, that organizations that judged people by their appearance rather than their capabilities weakened themselves in fundamental ways. Dr. Margaret Foster, a leadership researcher at Harvard Business School, had spent 2 years studying the institutional changes that followed the Rivera incident. Her analysis revealed that military units, which implemented the new evaluation and training protocols, experienced measurable improvements in morale, retention, and operational effectiveness. The correlation was so strong that other government agencies and private corporations began adopting similar approaches to leadership development and bias recognition. What makes the Rivera case so instructionally powerful, Foster explained during a keynote address to senior executives, is that it demonstrates the real cost of prejudice in terms that everyone can understand. When you underestimate people based on their appearance or background, you're not just being unfair, you're making yourself vulnerable to those who don't share your limitations. The story had also become a source of inspiration for individuals who found themselves underestimated, dismissed because of their gender, ethnicity, background, or quiet demeanor. Social media platforms carried thousands of posts from people who had drawn strength from Rivera's example when facing their own moments of prejudice and challenge. Her response to attack had become a metaphor for responding to any form of unjustified aggression with competence, dignity, and measured force. Maya Patel, a software engineer who had used Rivera's story as motivation during her struggle to advance in a male-dominated technology company, reflected on the broader lessons in a blog post that went viral among professional women. Rivera didn't win because she was physically stronger than Hayes, Patel wrote. She won because she was better prepared, better trained, and better disciplined. When someone attacks you based on their assumptions about your limitations, the best response is not anger but excellence. Prove them wrong through performance, not protest. The psychological aspects of the incident had also attracted scholarly attention. Researchers studying decision-making under pressure found that Rivera's response demonstrated exceptional emotional regulation and tactical thinking that could only result from years of specialized training and real-world experience. Her ability to maintain clarity and precision while under attack had become a case study in how elite performers manage stress and applied skills in unexpected situations. Colonel James Murphy, a military psychologist who had interviewed Rivera as part of a broader study on combat stress, found her to be one of the most psychologically resilient individuals he had ever assessed. She possesses an almost supernatural ability to remain calm and focused under pressure, Murphy noted in his research. But more importantly, she has internalized a value system that prioritizes mission accomplishment over personal vindication. She didn't neutralize Hayes because she was angry, she did it because his behavior represented a threat to institutional standards and professional conduct. Rivera herself had remained characteristically quiet about her role. In the transformation that had followed her encounter with Hayes, she continued to serve in various classified assignments, Her specific activities known only to those with the highest security clearances. Occasionally, she would appear at training facilities or professional development conferences, usually speaking about technical aspects of combat training rather than leadership or inspirational topics. When pressed by younger personnel about the incident that had made her famous, Rivera would typically redirect the conversation toward more practical matters. "The technique is the point, not the person performing it," she would say, echoing the same words she had used with the young sailor years earlier. "Focus on being prepared, not on being recognized. The mission is what matters, not the individual credit." Her approach to her own legacy reflected the same quiet professionalism that had characterized her response to Hayes's attack. She understood that her story had become larger than her individual experience, that it served purposes beyond her personal career or recognition. Rather than attempt to control or profit from her reputation, she had allowed it to serve the institution and the broader cause of military excellence. The ultimate lesson of Master Chief Rivera's story was not about gender or diversity or even military service specifically. It was about the universal power of competence over arrogance, preparation over assumption, and character over charisma. Her 3-second demonstration had revealed that the most dangerous people in any organization were often the quietest ones, that true strength rarely announced itself, and that the assumptions we make about others often reveal more about our own limitations than about theirs. In a world increasingly divided by surface differences and social media posturing, Rivera's example offered a different model of excellence, one based on substance rather than appearance, action rather than rhetoric, service rather than self-promotion. Her legacy would continue to influence military culture, corporate leadership, and individual behavior long after the specific details of that humid morning at Pearl Harbor had faded from memory. For Master Chief Carmen Rivera had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice and violence was not to fight back in kind, but to demonstrate through quiet competence that assumptions can be more dangerous than any weapon, and that those who underestimate the quiet professionals do so at their own peril. They had kicked her in the stomach, expecting her to stay down, and instead discovered that Navy SEALs don't stay down, they get even through excellence, and their revenge is the lasting change they create in the institutions they serve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.